Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Syracuse Sports. My name is Brent Axe. It is great to have you here. That's my Obi-Wan Kenobi, hello there impression. More fodder for a future Axe Brent Anything episode. Always willing to talk Star Wars, guys. That show is great, by the way. All you internet trolls out there that were ripping apart the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, come on, man. That show was gold. Gold, Jerry. Absolute gold. So we'll save that for another time. David Hale is going to join us today, who is one of my favorite people to talk to about a lot of things in life, not only college football, because David Hale always finds the number you don't know. If you follow David Hale on social media, and by golly, if you're not, please do. It's one of the few bright spots about social media. He always finds the number that no one else has. And David Hale is going to give you a stat on this show about Kyle McCord, Syracuse quarterback, which we're going to get into in another sense coming up here shortly. But he is going to give you a stat later on in this show about Kyle McCord. It's going to knock your socks off. Your jaw is going to hit the floor. It is absolutely incredible what David unearthed, and we will talk about that. Another realignment summer on the way. I'm not going to lie, guys. David Hale and I, big music fans. We talked about these two gentlemen over my shoulder if you're watching on YouTube, Springsteen and Tom Petty. So a little bit of music talk in there, too. Had to do it. David the other night, he's having a few beers. He's grilling, grabs his phone, and as one does, made a top 10 list of his favorite Tom Petty songs. So I surprised David today with my top 10 Petty songs after drinking a few beers and grilling as well. So we'll have a little fun, do some music talk with plenty of football on the way. Before we get to David Hale, though, a couple of things I wanted to mention to you guys. All right, now I'm going to put this on the screen if you're watching on YouTube. I'm going to ask the question. Don't throw things at me here, all right? LaNorris Sellers or Kyle McCord? Duck! Okay, just hear me out for a minute, guys. I'm fascinated by the world we're in today, where we have already kind of made the transition and accepted the fact that college football rosters are one-year deals. No matter who you are, recruit, transfer, whatever the case may be, you're on a one-year contract, and at the end of that 1 year, you have to completely reset the roster. Now, scholarships in the past have always been one-year deals, but it was kind of accepted like, you know what, I'm probably going to watch you play here for the very least the next 3 or 4 years. Maybe if you're pretty good, you leave a year early for the NFL. But now with the transfer portal, we're on one-year contracts. But I bring this up because if you don't remember LaNorris Sellers, he was a quarterback, 4-star player from South Carolina. He was committed to Dino Babers at Syracuse until he wasn't. Right to the end, at the end of his recruiting cycle last year, where he flipped to South Carolina and Shane Beamer. Okay. He is the now starting quarterback at South Carolina, won the job in spring practice. So it got me thinking a little bit here. If you're a Syracuse football fan, now again, put aside the players. And look, Sellers is 6'3", he's 220, he's got a big arm, he's mobile. I think he's going to be a star. I think he's going to be a player that South Carolina fans are going to be very happy to watch for who knows how long, right? But ideally, the next 3 years as the starting quarterback at South Carolina. Would you rather have that? A redshirt freshman that you developed, that you recruited, that you brought in, that sat for a year, wasn't thrown on the field, right? Got to sit behind a pretty talented quarterback in Spencer Rattler, learn now, competes, wins the job, and could potentially be your starting quarterback for the next 3 or 4 years. Versus Kyle McCord, who we know has a firm expiration date. He's a transfer, but he's an established transfer who's got credibility from Ohio State in the Big Ten, somebody that fits the pro-style offense like a glove that Jeff Nixon and Fran Brown are putting into place. The relationships, of course, prior there with Fran Brown. I get it. I think McCord wins this conversation because Syracuse football is doing all it can to hit the ground running and establish itself. Talent brings in talent. We've already seen that with, 19 commitments in the class of 2025, the transfer portal and the players that have come in. McCord lit that match. When McCord committed to Syracuse, it opened up a lot of eyes that if that guy is going to go to Syracuse, then I can go to Syracuse. So I get it. I'm just fascinated by the fact that we have completely turned the page on this. And one of the great things about being a Syracuse Sports Insider is when something like this pops in my head, I send it to you guys. I'm going to talk about this on the podcast. What do you think? And your feedback was incredible on this, and we're going to highlight some of your comments on this coming up here shortly, but let me remind those that are not to become a Syracuse Sports Insider, guys. If I have breaking news, you get it first. When these thought bubbles appear in my head, you get it first, right? The back and forth, the conversation, any questions that you have for me, any opinions that you want me to discuss on this podcast, to write about, to just ask me a question, I will text you back. Being a Syracuse Sports Insider gives you direct text access to me. And to become a Syracuse Sports Insider, all you have to do is text the word orange to 315-847-3895. You can try free for 2 weeks. After that, it's just $3.99 a month. What a better Mother's Day present than that. Look at my, signed you up. My mom could do the Syracuse Sports Insider text, and she's just not the most technologically savvy person in the world. So give it to Mom. She'll love it. Flowers, come on. Would you rather get flowers or sports text from Uncle Brent? Right? You guys were great on this, including Glenn, who says, for this year, it's got to be Kyle McCord. First-year coach needs to establish the program. It'll take an upperclassman with established bona fides, especially with the talent and potential. From James, who says experience wins, especially in this case, and especially with this schedule. By the way, Syracuse has, I saw a stat the other day, the second easiest rated schedule in what was the former Power 5, now the Power 4, with the Pac-12, rest in peace. And especially with this recruiter as the head coach. From Adam, who says, I get the logic, but these days you can't count on anyone for more than a year at a time anyway. From Will, the way I see it, Jakari should be the heir to the throne. I don't know what Brent and David is going to give you as a starter next year. He's not, because I think he's going to be a wide receiver. And I think Fran will look to develop Jakari as quickly as possible so that he can take the reins next year. I also think, however, that despite all the positive developments with the team, the quarterback room remains the most volatile from a depth perspective, and that's exactly why I brought this up, Will. Steve, I choose McCord at this stage. He's a name. He has credibility. He played at the highest level with success. Plus, isn't every player a one-year player now? A few more from our Syracuse Sports Insiders on this. Then we'll hear from David Hale coming up. Matt W. says, I agree. Go with McCord. With the portal, everything has changed. There's no such thing as developing a player anymore. They might skip town. Basically, everyone is on a one-year contract. Noticing a developing theme in this conversation. From Tampa, Ron. In the era of NIL and the transfer portal, Syracuse could develop him, meaning LaNorris Sellers. Then he could take off for a higher payday anyway. So get the hired hand if you need it. From one of my favorite text names. These texts come in. This is exactly how it appears. Not Lacey's boyfriend. Shout out to Lacey. Shout out to Brian, two of our great Syracuse Sports Insiders. And not Lacey's boyfriend, one of the more creative text names that we have. I'm bullish on Jakari Williams next season. So Syracuse could potentially be in the position that you mentioned if Sellers were here this season and no McCord. From Chris K. Sellers is the long-term play. But if Brown wants to win the fans, bring in a starter from OSU who went 11-1, the play is to build excitement and get the butts in the seats. And from Jake F., in another universe, we could have both. McCord starting and Sellers waiting in the wings, which is exactly my thought, Jake. And I think one of the great texts that we got on this, you're all in on McCord, and I get it, but they don't have depth, and we don't know who the heir apparent is. It just got me thinking how nice it was for South Carolina to go from Rattler. Now, there was a competition in spring, but now potentially Sellers sets the table for the next few years, where Syracuse will have to keep going in the portal, keep the hamster wheel spinning until Fran Brown finds his guy. One more thing before we hear from David Hale, guys. I want to say a big thank you to John Murphy, the voice of the Buffalo Bills. It was announced this week that Murphy will be retiring. For those of you that don't know, Murphy unfortunately suffered a stroke at the end of last year. He is recovering. Well, I believe it was actually 2 years ago, right? Chris Brown was the voice of the Bills last year while Murph recovered. I can't believe time flies on that. So thankfully, Murph is doing much better. He has recovered. He's doing interviews. He wrote a book. Shout out to Scott Petoniak that wrote that book with John Murphy, and he is recovering well. But Murph has decided to step aside as the voice of the Buffalo Bills. So, look, first as a Buffalo Bills fan, John Murphy and Van Miller before him have been the soundtrack of some of the great moments of my life, some of the worst moments of my sports life as well, frankly. But that's the point. They are there, game in and game out, and they are the soundtrack and the comfort food of being a Buffalo Bills fan. And there's still something that a connection can be made between a play-by-play broadcaster and the fan base. There is no greater ambassador for the Buffalo Bills and no greater ambassador for, frankly, the city of Buffalo than John Murphy. Personally, I was on the Buffalo Bills radio network from 2009 to 2011. And while I was excited about the gig as a longtime Buffalo Bills fan, I was also scared shitless to take that job. It's a big gig. You're on an NFL broadcast crew. I'm the guy from Syracuse coming in. Everybody else on the crew, all Buffalo guys, former Buffalo Bills. Shout out to Mark Kelso, who was on the broadcast at the time. I really had to prove myself. And from day one, from the minute I met him, and I knew Murph a little bit beforehand, but from the minute I walked in that room, in that first meeting, Murph could not have been more supportive. He welcomed me with open arms. Trust the work, have fun, know your stuff. You earn this. He knew I was nervous. He knew I was apprehensive a little bit. And I came in kind of late on the Bills radio network. I was supposed to have more of a minor role, and that turned into a bigger role due to a couple of things that happened. Somebody that couldn't do what they were originally going to do. And lo and behold, I become the pregame, halftime, and postgame host for the Bills radio network. Murph could not have been more supportive in those 3 years that I was there. And that was great. Murph is a Syracuse alum, by the way. But I'm more appreciative that I became friends with John Murphy afterwards and got to know him as a person. So shout out to Murph. Best of luck in the next adventure. Godspeed, my friend. And thank you for all you did for the Buffalo Bills radio network, most importantly, for Bills fans through the years. Let's hear from David Hale, ESPN. Wait till you hear this McCord stat he's got coming up, guys. David Hale is back here on Syracuse Sports. It was great to see David recently come up to Syracuse here, and I'm going to get your perspective on Syracuse football and all that. More importantly, though, give me the mini review while you were here. Springsteen at the Dome. What a show. What was the David Hale experience at that one?
First of all, I feel like, I don't know what the lighting situation is here. I'm in very like sepia tones here, which feels appropriate for talking about classic rock.
That's right.
Man, it was wonderful. And I think, one of the things that's so fascinating about going to a Bruce show is it has gone from like going to a Bruce show to sort of it's everybody's Rorschach test of like what a Bruce show is to them. And, I've seen Bruce, I want to say like half dozen times probably or so now, starting in like, I saw him on the Rising tour or maybe before that. And to see it now, I mean, it's a much different show than it used to be. He's high energy, but he's not what he used to be. And I think so much of like the theme of the recent tour is about like, what do endings look like? And what's it like when you're still out here trying to, do your job and live your life and be happy when some of your best friends are gone now. It felt very contemplative in a lot of ways, which is a thing that really resonated with me as I get older too. There's a Wright Thompson story that he wrote a while ago, years ago, about this bar in New York that he used to go to. That was like this old school New York bar that like all the writers used to hang out with and go drinking with, like, Billy Martin and Mickey Mantle and people. And, he couldn't wait when he graduated to like be a part of that entourage. And then they closed it. It was closing down when he wrote this. And so he went back for like one last, visit. And the gist of the story was how little the bar had changed. But that how much he had changed since he first wanted to go there and what that was like. And he's like, that's the mark of a truly great bar, is it doesn't change. It lets you know how much you've changed or how far you've come. I think there's a little bit of that to a Springsteen show these days of like, man, it is much a reflection of like who I am as I'm experiencing this show, than it is just the show itself. Maybe I'm reading too much into Springsteen because that's how my mind works when I start thinking about Bruce.
No, not at all.
To me, it's one of those things that like the show is awesome. It's the second time I've seen him on this tour. It's been great both times. But boy, like I think it was me being back in Syracuse, which I hadn't been back to in a while, and kind of reliving some of my glory days, so to speak, and then B, going to see Bruce and sort of doing that. But it's just I don't know. I don't think there's too many places. Like you can go see a lot of good shows. I don't think you go see too many rock stars that will leave you feeling different about the world or yourself after you go see them.
100%. And what you're saying about reflective and where he's at, when this tour was announced, and right here, if you're going to come to Syracuse, like, I'm going to be there. I'll drive almost anywhere to see Springsteen. But this time was all about, I wanted my daughter to see him. And my daughter, thankfully, one thing that we really bonded over is music. She listens to the same music that I do. Now, she listens to Taylor Swift and some things of her generation, but she loves 90s rock like I do. She loves Springsteen. And I'm like, you're going to this show. So remember, this show was postponed. Yeah. And it was postponed the night before he was supposed to come here. And my heart dropped, David, because I'm like, if my daughter doesn't get to see this show, it's going to kill me. It's going to kill me because I want her to experience this once. So for it to come full circle.
That was one of the cool things too, is like just seeing who was in the stands. I mean, there's a bunch of old white guys like us, but there was older white people than us, but there was people from like all different generations, all different backgrounds. Like
that little kid that was singing with him with the harmonica, right? Like, come on, this kid's 9 years old and he loves Springsteen. I love that.
It is amazing. I think it's still, again, I don't think there's anybody like Bruce, and there's a reason. Everybody, it's the the meme that every middle-aged white sports writer loves Springsteen. It's a meme for a reason, though. Like, it's true, and I think there's a genuine appreciation of. I think what all writers should aim to do is tell something that is both specific and universal at the same time, and I don't think anyone in the history of songwriting has ever done that better than Bruce. Which is why I think he's so attractive to people of all different generations. Frankly, I'm not the biggest Taylor Swift fan, but I think she does a very good job of that too, which is why I think your daughter can see the benefit of being into both of them. Jason Isbell's like, I think, the younger people's version of Bruce now, and he does a lot of that too. It's such a very hard needle to thread, and again, I don't think anybody's ever done it better than him.
Switching gears there, David, to what's happening in the football world. What's happening in the ACC is the opposite of what you just said, and the opposite of that bar that Wright Thompson recently wrote about. It's ever-changing, right? So here we go into the summer. Are we going to have another realignment summer? Are we going to have another, stay tuned, here comes craziness. We've got court cases going on, spring meetings next week. Gee, what are they going to talk about, right? Like, we're just in this ever-changing craziness when it comes to conference realignment. So what should we brace ourselves for over the next few weeks and months here? I know generally things are moving and grooving in the sport, but anything specific you kind of feel is knocking on our door?
So there's sort of two vantage points to look at this. It's sort of the micro and macro versions of this conversation. And it's the whole thing sort of fits into this big puzzle. It's like a Rube Goldberg machine is basically what college sports is right now. And the ACC has its piece in that giant machination of ridiculousness. And where that piece is obviously right now is you've got two schools that are suing the ACC. And one thing, I've said this like a dozen times, but it bears repeating. Florida State, for all of the bridge burning that they have done, has not said we are leaving the league tomorrow or any date. They have not said that. They are just seeing what they're going to have to pay should they choose to leave. And Clemson very specifically has said, we are definitely not saying that. We are looking at all of our options, and we just want to know what our options are with our lawsuit there. They're very careful not to cross a bridge to say we out. I think some people remember what happened with San Diego State a couple of years ago as they were negotiating, trying to get into a Pac-12 that no longer exists. But B, I think there's very much – nobody knows how these court cases are going to go. I mean, frankly, there's 4 of them right now. We may end up with a federal version of this somewhere along the way. And, you know, we're talking about races to the courthouse to see who gets jurisdiction. We're talking about races to judgment to see who should have primacy in an official ruling. All of these things are ludicrous. I don't have a law degree, so it's pointless for me to even explain that part of it, despite the fact that it would also put everyone to sleep right now. But the long story short is I think we're a long way away from a point in time in which the courts, if they ever determine this, are going to reach a determination. Again, we're appealing venue right now. So that's how far we are away from a verdict, and that verdict will be appealed as well, of course. So long story short, I think there's a lot of things in the works with the ACC, but not a whole lot that's actually happening. But what I think is happening, and if you want to look for really a big domino in this Rube Goldberg machine, it's the House versus NCAA case that is some stories out this past week about potential resolutions in that, which again, I'm not trying to put people to sleep, and it will put you to sleep if you think too much about it. But the gist of it is former athletes have sued the NCAA saying you restricted our rights to NIL over the years, and now you owe us basically back pay. And because it's an antitrust thing, it could be triple the damages. That's according to how antitrust cases work. So the NCAA does not want to pay this because, frankly, they don't have that kind of money. We're talking about multiple billions of dollars. So they're trying to figure out some way, if we negotiate a settlement here, and can we work with the federal government that says we're going to settle this and try to make good on some of the damage that we've done. We need, and in turn, we need you to help us out on settling what the future looks like. And I don't know. I've said for a long time the NCAA missed its window to figure out its own future, and frankly, the federal government has bigger problems than to worry about the NCAA. And so we're left with this miasma of terribleness that no one wants to write any rules. I think we're getting closer, maybe, to someone stepping up to write some rules. And if there is a settlement in that case, it is far from an end point, but it will be a major domino, because one of the outcomes of this, we expect, is that there will be some level of revenue sharing, 20 million or more a year from schools to their athletes. Now, how that gets divvied up, or how much each individual school spends, those are huge questions we don't have answers to now. But if you're Clemson or Florida State, or frankly, a number of other teams that are not in the Big Ten or the SEC, that $20 million got to come from somewhere. And the SEC and the Big Ten, I think, have been anticipating this for a long time. So when they get these big boosts in the money that they're getting from TV, it's less about like, oh, we can go build some great new facilities, or, oh, we can pay our coaches more. I mean, those things are true to an extent, but it was much more about, oh, let's set this bundle of cash over here because we're going to be paying it to the athletes soon enough. And if you've got the money to spend without having to make cuts, and Clemson and Florida State are going to have to whack a bunch of their budget just to be able to pay the athletes who already have plenty of incentives to go to the other leagues, that's a big, big, big problem. And so as we look about, like, what does the future look like, when Clemson and Florida State tell you this is existential for them, that's why. That's why.
And that's just one issue, right? We're talking about NIL coming in house. We're talking about, and I'm curious what you think about this. I talked to Nick Carparelli about this on the pod earlier this week. Kent Severud, Syracuse chancellor, was in on this. The concept of a super league and how that could solve some of these issues. And I think that the wins that I got initially from the Greg Sankeys of the world and the real power players in college football these days was, no, that's not going to happen. But the concept of it on paper sounds interesting at the very least. What did you think when you heard about that?
Yeah, so from what I've heard, the proposals, or the grand idea that was presented to the ACC and a few of the other smaller conferences, I think, was very serious and taken very seriously. And I'm sure that there's parts of the ACC, Clemson and Florida State, that would say, like, yeah, let's do that, because that could be our exit strategy. Mm-hmm. And just to put a pin in that for a second, this is one of the other things when you talk about what Florida State and Clemson want to do, and maybe potentially others down the road. Let's just say they reach a settlement agreement with the ACC to leave for $400 million or $300 million apiece. Like, you do that, and 2 years from now, there's a super league and everything's dissolved anyway. Boy, do you feel dumb that you wrote that check and you didn't need to. So that's a whole other part of this conversation. So anyway, unpinning that, I think that there's a lot that goes in. Almost every administrator I talk to seems to think some version of a super league or super leagues is the end point here. And what that looks like could be almost anything from an invitational type of thing. The SEC and the Big Ten just expand to a point in which they eat up everything else that matters. That's a reasonable possibility, though I don't think either league is interested in that today. Or there's some coalescence around a third-party entity. Maybe it's another TV network, or maybe it's a private equity or something along those lines that creates a new league that everybody goes to. Maybe it's a thing where you sort of opt in or opt out. Like we are going to spend X number of dollars on our players, and we're going to follow this set of rules that professionalizes things. And if you want to do that, come join us. And if you don't, you get to go be like the new Ivy League, basically. That could be an option too. All of this is very long-term thinking. And when I say long-term, I think we're probably looking bare minimum at another 5 years or so before we have serious conversations about what it might look like. One, because that's when TV contracts start expiring again. And as you look at every round of realignment and all the big trouble until the Florida State Clemson stuff, it has always matched up on the timeline about 2 years out from when TV deals are coming up. And that's for a very specific reason. The TV networks have so much say and sway over this, and somebody's got to pay for it all. And then the other thing is, like, Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey have a ton of power right now. I don't see either of them wanting to cede any of that power. Like, could the powers that be just mow over Jim Phillips and mow over the Big 12 and all the Group of Five and do what they want? Yeah, but I don't know that you can do that with Tony Petitti and Greg Sankey in the SEC and the Big Ten. I think they have too much stake in the status quo as it is, and so whatever the Super League or leagues looks like, their vision will be a big part of that. And one of the interesting things I've had a few ADs say to me is like, man, I have made my peace with the fact that I'm not going to be the one who sets the tone for what this all looks like, but I would kill to have somebody like Greg Sankey just get up and say, this is what my end game is. Yes. Like, at least paint the picture of what this is going to look like for us. Yes. So we can start rowing in the same direction. And we don't have that at all right now.
That's the macro, David, and we'll continue to follow that. And I know you and Andrea and the whole crew will be on that, and the always fascinating realignment summer that we're going to go into again. Let's zoom in on the micro a little bit here. It's part of your ACC spring football tour. You were here in Syracuse and got to talk to Fran Brown and get a view of practice and get a sense of things. You've certainly been following along here. We just passed 5 months since Fran has taken over the job, and I feel like, look, they haven't played a game, of course, yet. But in 5 months, the tone of the conversation about Syracuse football has completely changed, just based on he's showing receipts. He's bringing in transfers. He's up the recruiting for Syracuse. You've done everything in the offseason to change the tone of how people feel about things almost instantly. Has that been your impression, or what has been your impression so far?
Yeah, without question. I mean, he's given people something to be enthusiastic about, and that's a big thing. I think we maybe have a little bit of short memories that people were pretty enthusiastic about Dino when he got here too.
That's true.
Now,
yeah.
I don't think that the Venn diagram of how those two want to build a program overlaps very much. So I'm not trying to compare the two. I'm just saying it's very easy to get excited about a vision that somebody's selling you before the product has ever been put on the field. But my takeaways from Fran is that A, he relates really, really well to the players. B, so when I was up there, I was waiting to talk to him, and he was stopping to talk to a couple of high school kids that were there. You would call them recruits. They were not guys who were coming to Syracuse. These were just guys who play football near Syracuse and happened to be out at practice. And he gives them his phone number, says, call me anytime, talks through some wide receiver drills that they can do to get better. Like, I mean, he was invested for 10 minutes in this conversation with guys who are never going to help him at all. And I walked away from that saying, like, that's the thing. That's why he connects with people the way he does. He is invested in everyone who stands in front of him. And I think that's important for so many reasons, because it's not just about recruiting. It's about your donor base. It's about your fan base, all of this. And if I had to make a comparison of who that reminds me of, and it's a little bit the same in terms of the career path, it's Dabo Swinney, right? This was early Dabo. This is how he did. He had to change the narrative around a program that had gotten stale and frustrating. He connected with people and got them to buy into his vision, even though it wasn't necessarily obvious on the field yet. And then he had to go and change the recruiting profile. And look, this is my concern at Syracuse, because I fairly firmly believe this, but go back over the history of the last 40 years of college football, 30 years of college football. Who has genuinely changed their identity in terms of talent acquisition? I'd say it's Clemson and Oregon, and that's it. I mean, there's really not another Well, I mean, so I guess you could say some like Nebraska that have lost ground or ceded ground, but not a whole lot. Miami in the early 80s, Oregon in the 90s, and then Clemson in the late 2000s and into the 2010s. That's really like you get basically one every decade program that kind of steps up its game a little bit. I don't know how possible it is, but Dabo's done it. And so if you're making the comparison between just in personality and approach between Fran Brown and Dabo, then maybe there's something to be said about that. Now, I will say Dabo had the luxury of a lot more money to spend and a better recruiting area and all of the other problems. But, you know, again, this is a different world in college football right now. It's not all about recruiting high school kids. And Fran Brown has embraced that in a way Dabo certainly has not. The new era of college football.
Speaking of which, Kyle McCord was one of the first targets that was out there for Fran. New Jersey connection paid off as it has several times over since in both recruiting and the portal. You've been around. You've seen the quarterbacks that have come in, not only transfer portal-wise, but recruiting. But it feels like a bunch of ACC teams brought in transfers. Where was Kyle McCord? Where does he rank in terms of quarterbacks in the ACC? All things considered at this point.
So I've been doing some research for a piece I'm working on, looking at quarterbacks around the country. So here's the quarterbacks last year who finished with a better total QBR than Kyle McCord. Jaden Daniels, number 2 overall draft pick. Bo Nix, first-round draft pick. Dylan Gabriel, who's at Oregon now. J.J. McCarthy, first-round draft pick. Carson Beck, who is largely considered the best quarterback returning for this year, and Michael Penix, first-round draft pick. That's all of them. That's the entire list of quarterbacks who finished with a higher QBR than Kyle McCord last year. So you ask yourself, why isn't he still at Ohio State? Like, what didn't work out there? And certainly going to, I think Syracuse has upgraded its receiver talent quite a bit, but it's not Marvin Harrison Jr. God bless him. He should have been there. His dad should have pushed him there. I don't know what he was thinking, but that's neither here nor there. You know, the flaws in McCord's game last year, to me, were less flaws than just he wasn't elite in everything. He was good at a lot, but he didn't elevate Ohio State the way Ohio State fans have an expectation of being elevated, playing at that level. And, you know, I don't know how much of that is on him and how much isn't. But I think, you know, 2 things really stand out to me. One is he comes from a program that understands what it takes to win. And this has been my biggest takeaway from the acquisitions that Syracuse has made is it's not just that they're more talented guys. They're guys coming in from programs that have those expectations, not just to, you know, make a bowl, but to compete for national championships. And so there is a culture that gets set when you have guys who know it, have done it, have seen it, and know what it takes. And so McCord, particularly at that position, I think has a huge impact there. Strictly breaking down film, I mean, almost his biggest problem was, were you under pressure or were you not under pressure? Because when he had a clean pocket, he was genuinely as good as anybody in the country. When he didn't have a clean pocket, he was below average. And so does that mean the pressure's on the O-line? Does it mean the pressure is on the offensive scheme to try and keep him clean? Or does he improve? You know, maybe some combination of all 3 of those things. I think there's a ton of upside with that. So, you know, where does he stand in terms of the ACC? You know, I hate to repeat the popular narrative. I'm a sucker for Cam Ward. That guy looked amazing in the spring game. I've heard nothing but great things about him. But he's at Miami, and they have a way of cutting the knees out from some good players. The one I'm maybe most intrigued by is Grayson McCall at NC State because, boy, he has got a ton of weapons around him. Because I'm in the area in Charlotte, I've watched a good bit of Coastal over the last 4 years, and he's a really fun player to watch play. DJ at Florida State will be a really interesting one because, I don't know, I think we keep expecting him to be something different than he has been. I mean, he's been pretty consistently the same guy with marginal growth each year. How does that look in a Florida State offense that I don't think can look like it did last year because you don't have Jordan Travis anymore? That's a great question. But I think when you add program, fit, experience, talent level, all of those things that have to congeal for a great quarterback to have a great season, Kyle McCord's in that conversation of like, I think the pieces all work together where he's at right now.
You brought up a couple names there around the ACC. In your travels in the spring, what were some other things that jumped out to you that, to steal a phrase from you a few minutes ago, that you kind of put a pin in to come back to or really stood out?
I mean, it's hard to look at Clemson and not still see some offensive frustration. But I will say that, look, Dabo's an optimist. He forces everybody around him into his optimism. So you very rarely will get an offseason at Clemson where people are like, I don't know about this, I don't know about that. But it did feel like a level of different sort of buy-in and energy at Clemson that I think, I don't know. I don't know what the ceiling is for Cade Klubnik. I don't know what the ceiling is for some of their offensive weapons. But that to me is sort of the biggest wild card of like, is Clemson, because they don't have to be great at quarterback. They have to be average quarterback play, and I think they'll win the league because they're very good, everywhere else. To me, it's a big question. How good are they going to be there? I have talked to some folks around Florida State, and this is sort of around the same conversation of like, what do we expect from DJ Uyunglele? That, he's going to be directly compared to Jordan Travis because that's who had the job before. But if you look at what DJ does well and what his skill set is and what his personality is, it's probably a better fit historically for what Mike Norvell likes to do, which is to have this big bruising quarterback who can run a little bit but likes to chuck the ball downfield. He's a good locker room guy. He's a veteran leader. He makes good decisions. Like, that's DJ. So, I don't think they're going to be as dynamic as they were with Jordan Travis, but I think DJ fits what Mike Norvell wants to do really well. I think they could probably use another wide receiver in the portal. We'll see whether that happens or not. NC State is one of the teams that really, it's funny. Andrea and I have talked a good bit about NC State and Miami, and we both keep saying, like, haven't we been burned? How many times do we touch the stove before we remember that it's hot? But NC State has a lot of weapons. They have really done well in the portal this year. People will remember Dave Doran sort of out there stomping on the ground and saying, like, we need our donors to step up at the end of last season. Well, they've stepped up because they've really made some nice additions, particularly on offense. And I could see that being a really Robert and I is one of those offensive play callers that, if you remember, he was at Virginia a couple of years ago with Brennan Armstrong, and they had all those great wide receivers, and they're chucking the ball all over the field. It was a really fun offense that wouldn't invariably end up in like a 45-43 game most weeks. I don't know if that's what it looks like at NC State or not, but I do like the idea of a guy who likes to be creative offensively, having a lot of tools to play with. And then the other team that it's almost sort of the inverse of the NC State and Miami conversation. It's like, when everybody's down on them, that's maybe when you should start liking them. And that, to me, that's North Carolina. And again, people are going to point to the quarterback and say, well, no Drake May. Problem is, Drake May and Sam Howell were mostly the only things keeping that team afloat way too often. I think there's a much more balanced team at UNC this year. And, one of those examples of, like, I remember last year going to Florida State and seeing their offensive line and being like, man, Florida State's ready, because these dudes look like NFL dudes. And it had been a while since I said that about an O-line at Florida State. And then I went to Carolina afterwards, and I was like, that's not it. These guys ain't it. And Drake May's good enough to make you competitive anyway. Being at Carolina this spring, that is one of those areas that they have absolutely addressed. And you look at the O-line, and they look like dudes now. And so I don't know that they need the quarterback. They've got a 1,000-yard rusher in Omarion Hampton, who's one of the best in the country. They bring in Jeff Collins to coach the defense, and I know he was not a great head football coach at Georgia Tech, but he's a pretty darn good defensive play caller. And you have an offensive line, I think, that can actually stop some people now. That, to me, there's some pieces there that are going to tell a story for North Carolina that I think is not the story that's been told about UNC for a while, that may actually be a better formula for them than the one that they've had with Sam Howell and Drake May.
David, I'm going to close on this note here, and it's so appropriate what you said at the beginning, the classic rock tones that this podcast has taken on. So you'll see over one shoulder is Mr. Springsteen here, and for those of you just listening, you'll have to check out YouTube to see what I'm talking about. Over my left shoulder here is one Tom Petty. Now, I saw the other day on Twitter, or X if you will, David Hale's top 10 Tom Petty songs, which I will tell people about if they have not seen.
Well, I was drinking and grilling.
Drinking and grilling, which is always the best time to make these lists, by the way. From 10 to 1, Southern Accents, Have Love Will Travel, American Girl, Fault Lines, Square One, King's Highway, Rebels, You're So Bad, Wildflowers, Walls. Okay. I would like to counter with my Tom Petty top 10.
I'm very excited to hear this.
You ready?
A quick aside before you
Okay.
do this. I was driving to the grocery store with my 6-year-old daughter yesterday or the day before, and Dreamville came on, and she's like, "Daddy, this is a really good song. Who sings this?" And I was like,
"Oh, see,
now
it's on the list."
And now I feel like a good dad. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. These lists change. Like if you ask me my 10 favorite Springsteen songs, it will change every single time.
Oh, 100%.
Right?
Yeah. Yep.
So this is a moving, fluid list, but I just wanted to counter with my 10.
Okay. I'm excited for this.
Not done grilling or drinking, but here they are. Number 10, You're So Bad.
Yeah, great song.
I'm with you there. Number 9, Out in the Cold.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Deep cut. I like it.
Deep cut. And these are a mix of just songs that I love, but I just love those heavy, right out of the box, hit you over the face guitar riffs sometimes from Petty.
Is Mike Campbell the most underrated great guitar player in classic rock history?
100%. 100%. Does not get enough conversation.
Me and Les Johns, who covers Wake Forest, went to go see Mike Campbell and his band, the Dirty Knobs, in Winston-Salem last year. And it was
cool
tremendous. And he played Fault Lines, and it was, you could just burn the house down afterwards. It was so good.
How great is that? By the way, we could do 2 separate lists, one with the Heartbreakers and one just Petty. I mixed the two.
But the great thing about the solo Petty albums is he basically like got bored 3/4 of the way through making them and was like, I'm just going to bring all these guys back
and bring them back.
Little parts here and there anyway.
100%. Number 8, You Don't Know How It Feels.
Yeah.
Number 7, American Girl. I don't think you can have a Petty list without that somewhere.
Agreed. Yep.
Your number 1 is my number 6, Love Walls. Love the fact that Petty did an entire soundtrack himself on just an underrated, rewatchable 90s movie that's always fun to watch. She's the One.
There's movies that fall into this list of like the soundtrack is so good.
Yes.
And the movie is not as good, but you'll just rewatch it because the soundtrack's so good. Singles is number 1 on that list.
I was just going to say that. That's number 1 on my list.
Without question.
Great soundtrack. Okay movie. Reality Bites, same thing. Like we can
Reality
go. We can
Bites is actually a harder watch. I went back and I was like, this is a little more cringy than I remember.
Did not age well.
Yeah.
Did not age well.
Excellent. Singles excellent with an excellent cameo by both Chris Cornell and Pearl Jam.
100%. You know what else I just watched recently where the soundtrack is way better than the movie that I remember? Empire Records.
Oh yeah, that's another great one.
Another one.
Weirdly, so I'm a Delaware guy. I grew up in Delaware. Empire Records is supposedly set in Delaware. Also, Fight Club set in Delaware.
Wow.
Yeah.
We are learning so much on this pod tonight. Yeah. I did not know that. We're into the top 5. Rebels at number 5.
So good.
Number 4, Wildflowers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
King's Highway, number 3. I'm with you there. I just, come on, every time that song comes on. Number 2, you did not have this on your list, Honeybee.
Yeah. That
is one of the best guitar riffs ever.
The whole Wildflowers album is so damn good, and you could go down. What's the song? I'm totally blanking on it now, but like he recorded it for Wildflowers, then didn't put it on the album, and then some like random one-hit wonder from the '90s put it out, and Leave Virginia Alone. It's like a random one-hit wonder from the '90s that was one he cut from Wildflowers. That's how good Wildflowers is.
It's always amazing when you hear these songs, like how in the world did that not make that album? You'd think that was not good enough to be on that album.
Yeah.
And number 1, it's just as standard as it gets Petty-wise, but it's my favorite, Running Down a Dream.
It is so good.
Yeah. I mean, come on.
So
there you go.
Part, like everything about, and that is a great opening guitar riff for Running Down a Dream. But I love how much he just decided, like, I want to be buddies with Del Shannon and try to fix his career, and like references it in the opening line of that song. And he did help Del Shannon and then eventually I think alcohol got the better of Del Shannon either way. But you know, that's who Tom Petty was.
So there you go, friends.
Let me ask you before you go one last thing. So this is Petty's my answer to this now, but it used to be John Candy.
Okay.
If you could bring back one dead celebrity, they'd come back at exactly the age in which they died, and other than health-related issues, they would still have whatever issues. You can't say Cobain because he just killed himself the next day, in my opinion. Yeah. Any other celebrity, who would you say like we missed out on more of a window?
That is a hell of a question right there. I would probably celebrity.
Yeah, I mean, rock star, movie star, anybody.
So
I mean,
not
it's
an
not
athlete.
like your dad. Like that doesn't count.
No. Boy, that's a great question. Petty would be right at the top of my list, but we had gotten so much of his catalog.
Like, give me 5 more years so I can go see him one more time. I would have.
You know, I would probably say Chris Farley.
Yeah,
I think we missed. Farley gave us a great, catalog that's still there, but I feel like there was still so much more we could have got out of Farley.
Yeah. I wonder. My only thing with Farley is I wonder if he's a little like Cobain and like it was just so inevitable.
We're heading down that road.
Yeah. But I do.
I'm gonna think of like 5 more people. I'm gonna text you all of them.
Well, let's just
in
the near future, let's listen to a bunch of Petty, watch some John Candy and Chris Farley movies, and just embrace that they're still sort of with us.
Our version of the rewatchables there. Look for our spin-off pod. Where
this pod would have been great if we had just not talked about any football and only talked about Petty, Springsteen, and random 80s movies.
We appreciate you putting up with our classic rock conversation here. So,
David, a niche audience for this, but it'll be an audience.
We're going to hear from that niche audience, and they're going to love it. In the meantime, I await the day good fortune comes our way, and David Hale returns to Syracuse Sports.